The society was formed in 2020, and we have grown a little each year since then. So this is our first live speaking engagement. We're glad to have you all here with us. We have some things on the back table, newsletters, gift of deed forms if you have things or you know people that have things that they would like to donate to the society, you can pick those up. We have our brochures if you yourself would like to become a member of the Historical Society, that is available to you. The Augusta Historical Society will be sponsoring a garage feed coming up on May 5th and May 6th. We invite you all to stop and see us, get some good grub. And the Lions are selling raffle tickets for their customer appreciation event coming up on April 29th. You can see Dale Sella at the back table. He's waving his bag around. If you have any doubt about who you seek to buy that ticket, that would be your man. At this time, it is my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Alan Clark, who will give us all the history of the Lowry family. Let's give him a welcome.
Thank you. All right, this is the biggest TV I had to bring, so I'm sorry that it's not 3 feet wider and longer. So I don't know how much you're going to be able to see. A lot better than just my computer screen. So we'll see. We'll just go along. So, yeah, my name is Alan Parks, and I taught college mathematics for 44 years. The last 36 at Lawrence University in Appleton, Wisconsin. I've been retired for a couple of years and trying to stay out of trouble, and involved in quite a few volunteer activities. We had a memorial for my parents. My mother grew up in Augusta, and my parents were buried over the cemetery. And we had a memorial here, and I got to talking to Katie about our family history a little bit. And she said, maybe you come and give a talk. And so here I am, okay? Now, I want to start with some disclaimers. Was a good idea, right? Think of being invited to a friend's house after they've been on a long vacation, okay? Now, inevitably, they want to show you their pictures. And their pictures are mostly of themselves. And you've seen them before, so that's not all that exciting, but you do want to be encouraging about the trip that they took. Well, I made a trip into my family history. To clarify some details, and especially to honor my mother's many positive memories of Augusta. And I'm here inviting you to see the pictures. So how general is this talk? That's a good question. Well, I wanted this to be of interest outside my own family. I want obviously to talk to you guys. But it can't help me mostly about my relatives because that's the information that I have. So I hope that the things that are specific to my family, you'll see how to generalize or how to apply to other situations, maybe of people you remember. Is the speaker an expert? An expert mathematician. So, yeah. I've certainly spent a lot of time looking into various facts, and I don't think I'm going to tell any out-and-out whoppers here, but I'm certainly not an expert in historical research, so you have to take that as you will. And then finally, will the information be new to you? Well, I sort of hope so, but I may be bringing coals to Newcastle, as the saying goes. For some of you may be more familiar with aspects of Augusta history than I am. And I'd love to hear from you, even just in talking to some people before this talk. I found out several things about the town that I didn't know. So, okay. So let's get started. The first thing we need to do is get to America in the first place. And we do this from Slovenia. Now you can say Slovenia or Slovenia. I was raised saying Slovenia, so I'll pronounce it that way. This is a map of Europe. And again, I don't know how much can you guys see. Slovenia is this little bitty purple country right here, near Italy and Austria. It is sometimes confused with Slovakia. Slovakia is up here as part of what used to be Czechoslovakia. Slovenia was part of Yugoslavia. until it got its independence in 1991. So here's a map of Slovenia. And there are three cities that I need you to kind of keep in your head. Ljubljana is the capital of Slovenia, right in the middle. And then another city that we'll talk about is Klagenfurt. Klagenfurt is in Austria, just over the Slovenian border. It has a large population of Slovenians. And the third city is Trieste, which is on the Italian coastline. That also had a large population of Slovenians. So Ljubljana in the middle, Klagenfurt up in Austria, and Trieste in Italy. There will be a quiz. Okay. Now, just a little bit about Slovenia because it bears on the tail. Slovenia was part of the Kingdom of Venice for many years in what is now Italy, until 1797 when it was taken over by the Austrians. Now, the Austrians, though, made a treaty with Napoleon, and it was actually the French who administered Ljubljana for the Austrians. Kind of crazy, I don't know how that worked. But here's the point of that. The point is that the influence of Venice, Italy generally, France, and Austria was felt very strongly in Slovenia. And that really makes it a Western country, like Italy, rather than an Eastern country like Hungary, which is next door as well. Slovenia was a more Western country than an Eastern country. Many of the countries in which the Slavs settled were more Eastern. And that also explains why the predominant religious practice in Slovenia was Roman Catholic rather than Orthodox in some description. Okay, and that bears on our tale. In 1913, my grandfather, Frank Lowry, came to America from Slovenia. We're not exactly sure when he came to Augusta, but it was sometime before 1918, as we'll see. My grandmother, Mary Lowry, came to Sheboygan, Wisconsin from Slovenia in 1920. She came to Augusta in 1921 on her marriage to my grandfather. Back here. Okay. Now, the young man to the right here is 26 years old. It's 1912. His name is Franz Labrecht. And Franz was born in Slovenia in 1886. In fact, today is his birthday. My grandfather is 137 years old today. You must have arranged that. How did we do that? That was great. Because Slovenia was part of the Austrian Empire in 1886 when he was born, he would have told you he was born in Austria. He spoke Slovenian, Austrian German, Italian, quite a bit of Church Latin, but no English. Now, Franz had apprenticed as a traveling shoemaker cobbler, and he made his living walking through Ljubljana and from village to village nearby. Now, we have absolutely one artifact from my grandpa's work as a shoemaker, and it's this. So enjoy this as much as you possibly can. This is it. This is a shoe last. It's a mold over which you make shoes. You can actually make shoes of various sizes. I don't want to try to go into that because I think it's kind of complicated, but at least we have one of these. So. That's the show and tell portion. That's it. Now, this is a panorama of Ljubljana in 1910. And the reason I'm showing you this is I want you to notice all the buildings, and it's a little hard to see in this picture, but there's a lot of green space between the buildings. Families in Ljubljana lived in large multi-family buildings. Each family would maybe only have a couple of rooms in that building. But each of them had some kind of a large garden nearby an apartment building for growing vegetables and flowers. From early spring to late fall, almost every evening would be spent in the garden. It's an interesting combination of rural and urban life. The urban life, the city life is all packed in, but then you're, working on your land, basically, what you would on a farm. Now here's another drawing of Ljubljana, again in 1910. This shows a wealthier neighborhood. These are slightly nicer houses. But what I want you to notice is that the layout is exactly the same. Whether you were poor or whether you were wealthy, you lived in a large apartment building. Now, if you're wealthier, maybe you had more rooms and you weren't quite as wealthy. And then, again, there's lots of green space around here for gardens. So you would have, be it packed into an apartment building and you have a garden nearby. Now, Franz engaged in compulsory military service, as all males did, in his late teens, an experience he described as marching on black bread and coffee. This is a picture of some Austro-Hungarian soldiers around 1910. It doesn't include my grandfather as far as I know, but I thought it was kind of an interesting picture. Now, in the early 1900s, many people could see that war was coming to Europe and that this was going to be a doozy of a war. France did not like the tactics of the Austrian army that he'd been taught in his military service, and he did not want to fight on the side of the German Kaiser or the Turkish Ottomans. That's where he would have been as part of the Austro-Hungarian army. He told his family that this was a strong incentive to emigrate, added to having access to all the opportunities in America. So Franz Labrick immigrated in June of 1913 from Trieste, on the Italian coast, on a ship called USS Alice. And what I wanted to show you was a copy of a typical steerage contract. Explain this. There it is. Get it a little bit bigger now. Again, that's probably not going to help much. A steerage contract is the ticket that gets you on the boat in Europe to go to America. What I want you to notice about this, this one's going to Boston, not Grandpa was going to New York. But I want you to notice the price. It's 178.5 kroners. Now that's equivalent to 36 American dollars at the same time. It's about an average price for a steerage to get across. Now, in addition to that price, you would have to buy or bring food for the 2-week crossing, and that's not a ton of money, but some. And for reference, skilled workers in Ljubljana were making an equivalent of somewhere between $10 and $20 per week. So the point of that is the price of emigrating was not terribly high. Obviously, it wasn't zero, but it wasn't terribly high. Now, we don't know how Franz financed his trip, but many immigrants from Ljubljana paid out of their savings. When he arrived in New York, and on the immigration record, his name was changed from Franz Labrick to Frank Lowry, presumably more pronounceable, and so we'll refer to it by that name. His destination was Falls Creek, Pennsylvania. Now that's a very small rural town, about 1,200 people at that time, northeast of Pittsburgh. And his sponsor there was a man named Louis Slagg. That name is going to come up in a minute again. We don't know the terms of that sponsorship, but the typical arrangement was that Frank would have agreed to work for Slagg for a certain length of time, earning room and board at a small wage, but also able to take in piecework on his own to make some extra money. Now, it's interesting to me that he found the sponsor in a small town rather than in a larger city. For instance, Cleveland was the most common first destination for Slovenians. Okay, back to here. Let's see. Yeah. Now, we're not sure of Frank Lowry's whereabouts until 1918 when he completed a military draft registration card. This was when World War I was going on. And this is the front of that card. Now, there's some interesting things. First of all, his permanent address is given as Augusta. Okay, there's his birthday. Also notice it says that his occupation is shoemaker, no surprise there, but his employer is himself. He's self-employed. Now, as I mentioned, he started his American journey in Pennsylvania. He apparently first came to Augusta to work for a shoemaker named Kelsey Denson, who was a German immigrant. Denson rented a house on Stone Street at least by 1910, but he was already 70 years old then. So we can speculate that Frank moved to Augusta to be Denson's assistant with the prospect of taking his place, since the older man would have been nearing retirement. So what does that tell you? Well, he came to Augusta to work for this man Denson, but then by 1918 he's self-employed. So he had to have been in Augusta at least a little bit of time before 1918 to make that happen. But now the other piece of information is down at the bottom. We can see this. You're supposed to put the name of your nearest relative in the United States. Well, Frank didn't have any relatives in the United States. So if you can't do that, you have to put down somebody who can vouch for you as a character reference. So he actually put down Louis Slade from Fall Street, Pennsylvania. He put down his sponsor back in Pennsylvania. So what does that tell us? That tells us that although he had been in Augusta long enough to launch out in his own business, he hadn't been in Augusta long enough to have a dead certain bona fide character witness that he could point to, like somebody who owned a business or a bank or something like that. Okay, so that we don't know, but that makes me think he might have come to Augusta 1916, maybe early 1917. That's a guess, but it has to go between 1913 in Pennsylvania and 1918 here. Okay. Now, in the 1920 census, Frank is listed as renting a house on Stone Street and as the head of a shoe shop with one employee. In that census, Denson is listed as owning a house with no mortgage on Lincoln Street. So we speculate that just kind of confirms the idea that Denson had sold his business and bought a house with the proceeds, maybe. Okay, that's a newspaper. In the 1920s, there were actually at least 3 newspapers published in Slovenian in Wisconsin, circulating throughout Wisconsin, northern Illinois, and eastern Minnesota. This is a typical front page with the name of the paper at the bottom. Now we know that Grandpa read at least one of these papers at the Augusta post office where a copy was sent each week. We're not sure exactly which one, but he said that he went to the post office every week to read the newspaper. Probably other people did too and read the same copy. Okay, now you got to hold that thought a little bit. Here we have another little mystery. In late 1920s, my grandpa found out that a single Slovenian woman, aged 25, had arrived in Sheboygan. So he wrote her a letter proposing marriage. Okay. Now, my mother told me that Grandpa found out about the woman from the Slovenian paper. Now, that's curious, because these papers, pretty much all of them, were extremely political. They had a little bit of news, but it was mostly commentary. Wow, how could that be? News people would make commentary. So either there must have been some kind of social news in these papers that would inform you that somebody had arrived somewhere. Or a slightly more complicated hypothesis is that there was some kind of advertisement for a position in Sheboygan, and Grandpa, that wanted a young woman. And Grandpa wanted a young woman too. So he had good ones. So he found out from the advertiser who had filled the position. But in any case, he wrote a letter. And she accepted the proposal. Yes. The two were married in March 1921 in Sheboygan, and that 25-year-old woman was my grandmother, whose maiden name was Maria Teresa Promslice. I would love to have that letter. Grandma was born in November of 1895 near Klagenfurt, a city that I mentioned in Austria, close to the Slovenian border. We know very little about her upbringing, except that the family was Slovenian and consistent with their name, Promslice. Promslice is a Slovenian name. Maria emigrated in August 1920, leaving Europe from Trieste on a ship called the President Wilson. She was about 24 years old when she left her country. So that's kind of bold, right? She arrived in New York 2 weeks later in September of 1920. And on her arrival form, her first name Maria was written down as Mary, and she was known as Mary ever afterwards, even by her husband and children. Both Frank and Mary fully adopted their American names. Mary was headed to Sheboygan to work for a family that had sponsored her. I don't know their names, but the population of Sheboygan in 1920 was about 31,000. That's big for a Wisconsin city. That would be big now. And of that 31,000, there were roughly 2,600 Slovenians. So that's a very significant minority of about 8%. It's quite a few. Now, we don't know the precise nature of the arrangements Mary had in Sheboygan, but it is interesting that she was allowed to leave Sheboygan after only being there for 6 months. She got to Sheboygan in September of 1920, and then she was married in March 1921 and moved to Augusta. So whatever the arrangements were, they either involved no debt at all or a very small debt that could be disposed of, or perhaps, and this was true for some women and not others, that her sponsorship reverted on the occasion of her marriage. It was sort of a marriage clause. So they got married. And here they are in their shoe shop on Stone Street in 1927. Now there's no date on the picture, but we can date the picture in a couple of ways. There's a calendar, there's actually several calendars. This is a very washed out picture. You can see the edge of a calendar over here. We kind of figured out the calendar. And because of that child, we know who that child is. That's Helen that I will tell you about in a little bit. So we can figure out this is 1927. Now it is something of a tribute to Augusta that my grandparents returned to my grandpa's business when they were married. After all, there were several larger communities of Slovenians in Wisconsin. Besides the community in Sheboygan, there were over 20,000 Slovenian people in Milwaukee at the time, many employed at 2 large tanneries or at the Alice Chalmers factory in West Allis. Grandpa greatly preferred living in a small town to a large city. Now remember his experience working in the countryside among the villages. I think he felt that village life was much better, just like that much more than life in the big city packed in with all of your neighbors. And also he had established himself in Augusta and was working successfully with the people here, so I think he was just happy. Now we don't have any pictures of my grandpa at all, really. This is a picture from the 1940s. He has his trademark whiteout cigar. He was, I don't think he was allowed to smoke in the house. Well, in March of 1926, Frank Lowry became a citizen of the United States. And Mary Lowry became a citizen in March of 1929. I think she became a citizen about as soon as you could become a citizen and be here for a certain length of time. This is a picture from the 1930s. We also don't have very many pictures of her. Okay. What's next? Okay, so by the beginning of the 1920s, Frank Lowry had an established business. Frank and Mary were married and ready to begin the serious business of raising a family. So there are their 4 children. This is in 1927, and I'll mention them each in turn, noting first that they all graduated from Augusta High School. So the oldest is Marie. Marie is over there. She was born in 1922. Now, my Aunt Marie obtained a bachelor's degree in chemistry from the University of Wisconsin in 1944. She lived almost all of her life in Madison. Now, I want us to appreciate the jump here in Marie's education from that of her parents. What would Marie's education have been back in Slovenia? Probably similar to that of her parents. That's roughly the 6th grade level. Now, that's nothing to look down on. Their education was rigorous and prepared them for apprenticeship or for various sorts of jobs. or to get further training if you were able to go in a professional direction. So it was not like it was an efficient education, but it was at the 6th grade level. And here, Marie's ability allowed her to get into the largest educational major university in the state. And that's quite a leap. Aunt Marie died in 1990. She was really a character. And I have very many fond memories of her. I tell stories about Aunt Marie all day. Very interesting person with a wide range of interests, from Oriental history to politics to everything. She was just fun to talk to. She used to call me in my dorm when I was at UW-Madison. I would pick up the phone and she would say, "Who is this?" "You called me, sweetheart." I recognize the voice. Okay, let's see, do I have another picture? Yeah, this is another picture of Marie up there in Grandpa's Model T, and boy was he proud of that. He drove it very, very slowly. I think it was a product of the horse era. Like, any faster than the horse. And that's Grandpa, and then he has another child there we'll talk about in a minute. Okay, now the second child, there's Marie in the back, is Anne over here. Anne was born in 1924. And she was also an interesting person. She had a career in the Army. She started with the WACs, the Women's Army Corps, at the end of World War II, and then when the WACs were incorporated into the regular Army, Anne went right along with them. She rose to the rank of colonel, and she worked as an administrator until reaching full retirement age, entire career in the Army. Very unusual for a woman, even now. Anne died in 2004. The third child is Helen. Helen is over here on that side. Helen Lowry was my mother. She was born in 1925, and this is a picture of her first communion day. There she is in the middle. That's Anne, that's Marie. We'll talk about the little guy in a minute. Now, my mother wanted to be a nurse, but when she graduated from high school in 1944, the family finances did not support that goal. Fortunately, a woman resident of Augusta volunteered to pay for my mother's training. Now, she mentioned the sponsor's name more than once, but I can't remember it, so sorry about that. Helen went to nursing school at a Catholic hospital in Milwaukee, and she also trained at a Veterans Administration hospital. She married my father in May of 1952, and after he returned from service in the Army, they had 7 children in a span of 9 years. And yeah, some of you know what that's like. I'm the oldest, so I always get the blame. After the youngest child was a bit older, Mother worked part-time as a nurse where we lived in Whitewater, but she always considered her family as her main career. She died in 2014. Now finally, the fourth child is this boy in the front here. There's my mother, Helen, and Frank Lowry Jr. was born in 1927, known to everyone as Fritz. Uncle Fritz was another real personality. The family just seemed to grow personalities. Very sociable, very active, an outdoorsman, and just, a great guy to be a friend with. But he died tragically of a heart attack at the age of 36, leaving a wife and 8 children. Yeah, it was hard. My aunt had that's another whole story. She was a true saint. So we didn't have him run as long as we wanted. Now here's a picture of the Augusta High School that my mother and her siblings graduated from. This is, as the caption says, it was built in 1919. Now my mother was proud of the education she received here. She liked her teachers very much, and there were many, many activities. She and Marie were in band. I'm pretty sure at least 2 of the family were in some kind of choir. Fritz was involved in athletics, and all of them were busy in various clubs and attending events of all kinds. They felt like it was a very rich experience, and they all felt well prepared to launch whatever they were going to do next. I'll close this section with a picture of Uncle Fritz in his glory days as a football player. My children and grandchildren all played football. They don't have so kind of a football family. Now I'm going back to the shoe shop of 1927. You remember having seen this. I have tried to trace the history of Frank Lowry's work as a shoemaker. What I want you to notice about in this picture now is the lathe rotor kind of thing there, and then you can see the edge of a professional quality sewing machine. Those are electric, and Grandpa was very proud of his equipment, his electrical equipment, and his modern methods. Now, it is difficult to get definitive information about Augusta businesses during this time. So here my talk gets a little bit jumpy. Try not to be too incoherent. Your own city website has a business directory from 1874, and I suppose if you look through this, you might see some names that are sort of famous and that you recognize. What I want you to notice is the shoe shop, F. Dittmer inside, boots and shoes. When Kelsey Denson came to Augusta, he worked for Mr. Dittmer. And before then, Denson established his own business as a shoemaker. And I mentioned before that my grandpa worked for Denson when he first came to Augusta. Now, another source of information, there's no way you're going to be able to see much detail on this, so I'll point out some things and then give you a summary in a minute, are the Sanborn maps. The Sanborn Map Company made maps of all kinds of cities across the United States on a regular basis, and they were commissioned by fire insurance companies. Now, I can't make this picture big enough for you to see it in detail, but you can at least get an idea. They wanted the fire companies to know what the buildings were. And then they listed on the picture, they list the building type, like what the business is that's there. But unfortunately, not the owner. We would like to have people information. So you can see this is Lincoln Street at the top of this part of the map, and Stone Street going down here. And obviously, you can see this at all. There's a real assortment of businesses along Lincoln Street and going down Stone Street. Here's another page of that same map. This time, Lincoln Street is at the bottom and Stone Street's here. And you can just kind of see there's quite a few businesses there. So what I did was I took some pages of this map and just made a little bit of a quick listing. So here are the buildings that are businesses along Stone Street. Just get an idea of what sorts of things were going on. This is where the city hall was. There were 2 meat markets, 2 cobbler shops, so 2 sort of repair shoe shops, a couple of warehouses, telephone exchange, pool hall, millinery, and so on. Now, in 1910, where my grandpa's shoe shop is now, or was long ago, on Stone Street, that was a millinery. And next to it was a tailor. We'll point out a picture of that in a minute. Here are some of the businesses along Lincoln Street from Spring Street going east. 2 ag implements, you just kind of look at this, a couple of hardware stores. There was a tin works in one of them. 2 jewelry stores. That's quite a few for a small town. A music store. I'm a very serious amateur musician. I would love to know what's in that. Some offices, 2 drug stores, one of which had a creamery and made huge amounts of butter every day. And again, 2 more milliners. You had 3 in 1910. You had 3 places to buy a hat in Augusta. You could really do your comparison shopping. The post office, the obligatory 3 saloons. Okay. Quite a lot going on. Now, another source of information, and this gives us some more particular information about the 1920s, is the Eau Claire County Statistical Reports. These were done roughly every year, and they compile data for little cities and towns throughout the county. There's just a couple things in here I want to show you that I think you'll find interesting. The Augusta residential property value totaled $735,000. Okay, but look at this. The mercantile property value is only $240,000, 1/3 of the residential property value. Now, that's the value of the land underneath the building, not the value of the stock, not the value of the building. Okay, just the land. What's interesting about that is the ratio of about 3 to 1 of residential property to mercantile property value. And that's quite unusual, although it was quite common in Eau Claire County. If you look at different things here. Normally, the mercantile property value is way, way higher compared to the residential property. What that shows us is two things. One is, it shows us that a premium was placed in allocating land. A premium was placed on residential property, houses for people to live in. It wanted people to live here. The second thing is that, you saw there were quite a few businesses there along Lincoln Street and Stone Street, other places in town, surely. So what you see is that those businesses had to be packed, had to be laid out very efficiently. You don't have a lot of space in your hardware store, so you really have to pack things in efficiently and be careful about how you use the space. That's kind of an interesting thing. Here's one. There were 223 automobiles in Augusta in 1925. I don't know. Does that seem like a lot to you? That seems like a lot to me. And the average value was $275. Now, a brand new Model T in 1925 cost $290. The price of the Model T had actually been decreasing from 1920 on. But it was $290. In other words, those cars, those 223 cars, are not just old clunkers laying around. Those are functioning and probably in pretty good shape. So that's an interesting thing. So the car had come to Augusta in force. But there were still some horses and mules, 95 horses and mules, average value of $73. I don't know. Can you think where would you put 95 horses and mules? Okay. That still does seem like they were quite a few. So although the car had covered the horse was not obsolete. Okay. Now, let's see. Okay, yeah, the next thing, there we go. Okay, so this is a picture of a shoe shop from 1933. You can't read, you can maybe see that there's a sign in the window, there's a shoe shop. And it had the balcony went the width of the building, I remember that. And the window, it says electric shoe repair. I've already mentioned my grandpa was very proud of his electrical equipment to do repairs. The building to the left, that would be south on Stone Street, is a tailor, as it says on the sign, and that had been a tailor for a long, long time before that. It's kind of interesting. Okay. Here's a picture from 1945. This is my grandparents at the entrance to the shoe shop. They had just been to Toronto to visit relatives. One of my grandfather's brothers moved to Toronto. And then finally, I can't let this section go by without a picture of some snow. This is a view of Lincoln Street in 1920. Now, my mother had many stories about the snow. We lived in Texas for a while, and so it was like snow. But anyway, she had some amazing stories. Now, she was not the person given to exaggeration. So, you guys must have had some real snow in the 1920s and 30s. She talks about how life goes. Now, I want to close by talking about experience and character. How did growing up in Augusta as the children of Slovenian immigrants shape the character and values of my mother and her siblings? My mother loved Augusta and loved to talk about her upbringing. Although her family could not have been very well off, she never mentioned that. She had a great affection for the people she grew up with. So I want to give 5 principles that my grandparents passed to their children. And principles, these are all principles that my generation has also passed along to our children and grandchildren. The first one is, think of yourself as an American. Frank and Mary did not teach their children to speak Slovenian, and they didn't pass on Slovenian music or folktales. Now, they were not ashamed of their Slovenian origin by any means. They talked very freely about their own upbringing and families, but they wanted their children to think of America as their country and their future, and to be completely at home here. They spoke Slovenian only when they were alone and did not intend for their children to overhear. Of course, children sometimes overhear things they shouldn't. My mother learned only a couple of Slovenian words, the most notable being the word for your backside was the side that might be paddled if you were disobedient. Apparently, when Grandma was provoked, she slipped in some Slovenian. Now, Grandma did pass along 2 Slovenian recipes that were identified as such. My mother learned to make what she called polipkis, which are Slovenian cabbage rolls that could be filled with meat, you can afford to buy meat, or with cheaper types of fillings, if that was the case. And for holidays, there was a sweetbread called patitsa. Now, patitsa is made by rolling bread dough around a filling of brown sugar, raisins, and walnuts to make a loaf. This is a picture of a patitsa cake. My generation, we made a cake. My mother grew up on patitsa bread, basically. But anyway, my mother said she could tell how the family finances were going by the number of raisins and nuts in patitsa. You can see. How are we doing? How did Dad do this year? But think of yourself as an American. The second principle is use what you have at Thanksgiving. As I mentioned, my grandparents were not well off. There are probably many of us, including me, who remember meals made of whatever was at hand. Basic meals with potatoes and soup and noodles and cheap cuts of meat predominating. But everything was taken with a spirit of thanksgiving and gladness to be together, and that makes all the difference. When I was growing up, we had a very large yard, and roughly an acre was set aside as a vegetable garden. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was living out the tradition of the Augusta, in which my parents had grown up. We had the land, we used what we had, and we were thankful. The third principle is pursue an education that is practical but extends to higher things. My grandparents placed a high value on practical job training, as one would completely expect, just to be able to support yourself. But they also strongly encouraged their children to develop the ability to think clearly, to have a taste for the beautiful, and to pursue an understanding of the past. I think we can see evidence of this in the lives of their children and the lines that they pursue themselves. This idea has been passed to my generation and our family. We see both of these functions of education as essential. So, education that's practical, but also extends to higher things. Participate in community. My grandparents articulated having a strong stake in the well-being of a community that sees itself as providing a future to its residents. I mentioned that it seemed natural for them to stay in Augusta, even though there were larger communities of Slovenian immigrants in other places. And finally, the most important legacy of my grandparents is their simple, solid Christian faith, which anchored and oriented their experience in America. It connected them by common values and outlooks to their neighbors, whether they had the same background or not. And I know that I and my 3 children would all say that our faith is the center of our lives, and their children would say the same thing. But that's the one I most treasure. I wanted to close with a picture of my oldest son's raised gardens. He's very proud of these. Using the garden as a metaphor. Gardening takes planning and hard work, but it also depends on things outside your control. In the end, its purpose is surely the practical provision of food, but the satisfaction one gets goes beyond that, especially when the overabundance of big zucchini is shared with others and when the work encourages a deep thankfulness. So thank you so much for listening. And I think we're going to have time for questions or comments. Maybe we can go around and talk. Yeah. Go ahead.